Welcome to Convos from the Couch from Lifestance Health, where each episode you'll hear engaging and informative conversations with leading mental health professionals that will help guide you on your journey to leading a healthier, more fulfilling life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health. I'm Nikki Lienza, and on today's episode, I'll be talking with Jae Swanson, a clinician from one of our Philadelphia, Pennsylvania offices, and we'll be having a conversation about helping kids deal with grief. So welcome, Jae. Great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is really a significant conversation for us to be having because we know it's so important to talking to kids, adolescents about grief and loss. So I'm really appreciating that we're having this conversation today.
Absolutely.
And let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I'm Jae. I use they, them pronouns. I live and work in Philadelphia. I've lived in Philly for about 13 years. I have a background in music therapy, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor in PA. And I spent the last 10 or so years mostly in hospice work. So I have a lot of experience with hospice and terminal illness, and in the last 6 years working with kids who are grieving the loss of a loved one.
So you definitely bring to the table lots of experience with this topic, and it definitely sounds like one of your specialties.
Absolutely. Yep. And it's a very under talked about, yet very common thing.
Right. No, I agree, which again is why it's so important that we're having this conversation to help guide others, caretakers, parents, whoever have children or adolescents in their life to talk about this. So to get us started, let's start with, what does grief look like in children and adolescents? And I get developmentally, it might look different in children and adolescents, but you can take it from however you want to divide that. So.
Yeah, I'll talk developmentally in a little bit, but for now, just kind of focusing more narrowly on how does grief show up in kids, which is surprisingly not all that different from how it might show up in adults, except that, kind of depending on age, kids have less of a filter. Kids are more likely to respond kind of naturally and immediately to what's happening, especially younger than, say, 12. But what they need and how we approach working with kids is not that different from working with adults. So I wanted to talk about two specific models that I really think are valuable. One is from 1985, someone whose last name is Fox, and he talks about the 4 tasks for bereaved children. These are not supposed to necessarily happen in any order. And just like anything with grief, we're going to do one thing and maybe it's going to be less the next day and we're going to do the next thing and come back to the first thing. So not necessarily in order, but the 4 tasks are to understand and make sense of the loss, make sense of what happened, how it happened. The second is express reactions to the loss in some constructive way. So that can be just talking, that can be emoting, that can be using different expressive like arts modes. The third task, learning how to keep on living and learning how to keep on loving other people. And the 4th task is commemorating that life that was lived. And that is something that you can do, especially as a child. You're going to maybe do that for a very long time to come over the course of your whole life. So learning how to do that and learning that it's okay to do that at a young age is really important and will help kids in their adult life when they have to, of course, have another loss in their life. And then another model, which is more common with also adults, is called the dual process model. Stove and Shute are the authors of this, I think, starting in the late 90s. And the dual process model is the idea that in grief, we oscillate between loss-oriented modes of being and restoration-oriented modes of being. Loss-oriented meaning actually really grieving and mourning and maybe experiencing tearfulness or anger being in counseling, doing memorial services, any kind of commemoration. And restoration oriented is having to do your daily living tasks. Maybe sometimes having to do some of the tasks that that deceased person used to do. Learning how to love other people and continuing relationships with other people. Rebuilding a different life that you're now going to be living without that person. And we're going to naturally oscillate between all those things within, in the beginning, it might be within like an hour or minutes that you're oscillating. And as you move forward in grief, you might spend more time in restoration oriented. But your whole life, you're going to spend some time in loss oriented, and that's normal.
And I think you're bringing up such a good point, because I think people think you just move through stages of grief just very linearly, and that's not the case at all. And I like how you're using that word oscillating. I think that's very important for people to understand.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of people have kind of tuned into the Kubler-Ross model, which does, I don't know if she intentionally wanted people to think about it linearly, but people do.
Right.
And then they feel like they're failing if they don't meet those tasks. Yeah.
So that's why I like the task that you brought up, the 4 tasks with the first model there. I really think that it really gives people a good idea of guidance. Both models are very good, but I like the idea with the tasks, of kind of like, what are we working on as we're grieving through this process,
Yeah. It's a good model for therapists.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Good guidance for us,
Yeah, exactly.
So can you give us some specific tips on how to talk to kids about death and dying?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of adults have an instinct to protect kids from things like death and dying because understandably, we're concerned that it's too much for them. They'll be overwhelmed. We want them to keep their kind of like innocence. However, kids know what's going on most of the time, regardless of what we say or don't say. And when we don't say things, we're showing, number one, like there's something bad about talking openly about this, right? And then number two, if kids don't know what's happening, they sometimes, or even most of the time, will imagine something worse, which can lead to like a lifetime of anxiety. So helpful to be very transparent in a developmentally appropriate way, right? So kids who are under 2 really have no concept of death and dying, but they will feel the loss in their own way. They will feel the emotions of other people around them. And so you might see that impacting them in terms of their own moods and their own like needs and things like that. And that's normal. Ages 2 to 5, that's when you can already start using the words death and dying, and we recommend using those words. Otherwise, it can be very confusing. So, for example, if you say like, grandma went to sleep and she's never going to wake up.
Right.
That's going to make a child maybe scared to go to sleep.
Right.
Or even that she went to heaven. Well, why did she go to heaven? Why did she make that choice? Why can't I go there with her? Why can't she come back?
Gotcha.
So being straightforward about grandmother died, her body stopped working, she cannot come back. And then if you believe in heaven or have religious beliefs, then you can certainly use them. But that being the first thing you say can be confusing. Ages 2 to 5, they're going to have a harder time understanding the permanence of death.
Yeah.
So kids that age are going to need a lot of reminders that the person isn't coming back. And that can be really hard, especially if you're also grieving the loss as an adult. Or if you're a therapist and you feel like this kid should know this by now, and you're working on it, but they just need a lot of reminders. And over time, as they see that the person's not coming back, they'll start to understand that. Ages 6 to 9, there's more of an emerging understanding of death and what that means. Something that can come up around that age is fear about their other loved ones dying, or their own self dying. So it's beneficial if they can talk about those feelings.
And that it's normal for them to be feeling like that. I think normalizing that. I think sometimes kids bringing that up might make the caregivers around them get even more worried, like, oh my gosh. And it's to kind of a reminder that might be just a natural worry that they're going to have. It's a normal, typical worry.
So. Exactly. Yeah. Very, very common. For kids ages 9 to 12, that's when they can really start to understand that death is final and irreversible. And then 13 and up, they're going to be thinking more about future implications of the death. So thinking about, they're not going to be at my wedding or my graduation, things like that. And in starting around age 9 and up, you start to see kids maybe even thinking about it somehow their fault. And again, normal and something that they need to be able to talk about so they can actually process through. And just, again, constant reminders that, it's not their fault. They don't have that much power. And talking about what actually happened so they can see that more tangibly. Other things to keep in mind as an adult caregiver, or even as a therapist, showing your own emotion about someone dying is okay. In fact, it models an appropriate response to grief. And kids can see if you are hiding your emotions and not expressing them, and then get a message that that's what you're supposed to do, right? But as we all know, especially as clinicians, like if we holding all those emotions in lead to problems in the future. And then another thing is for caregivers, and if we as therapists are counseling caregivers, offering kids choices around things like attending the funeral, maybe participating in the funeral. Mm-hmm. If we're approaching someone dying, like, do they want to see them? How much do they want to see them? Again, that's when you're talking about visiting, really being transparent about what that person looks like before that kid knows what they're walking into.
Right.
And the kids can choose what they feel comfortable with. If a kid absolutely doesn't want to attend a funeral, that's okay. But most times they do. And sometimes parents think it's protective, or caregivers think it's protective to not let them go to the funeral, when actually sometimes that can lead to long-time resentment.
Right. I've worked with a lot of individuals who maybe when they were younger was kept away from the funeral, or just even allowed to speak about the person who had passed, and how that still plays out, that it maybe even inhibited their own grieving process too. So it's definitely, I think the more openness and then the autonomy I think the more autonomy you can give kids to choose, do you want to go? Do you not? Do you want to see? Do you want to go up and visit the body if it's a showing? Things like that is so key that you're bringing up, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And giving them a sense of some control over something.
Yeah, right.
In the process.
For sure. What about, so now you brought up some really great tips on how to start those conversations and have those conversations. So what about the actual navigating of the grief for kids and adolescents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, not super different for adults and kids here. It takes time, sometimes a lot of time. Not pathologizing it, which the DSM has this new diagnosis that pathologizes grief a little bit, we have some conflict about that. One of the ways I started to think about how to help kids with grief is looking at a kid's individual personality, and looking at a kid and their tendency to be maybe more introverted or extroverted, because kids who are more extroverted will have more of a need to talk about it, and sometimes maybe a lot, and sometimes adults feel like they're making other people uncomfortable, but it's good for them. They need to talk about it. And in talking about it, they're normalizing talking about it for everyone. But more introverted kids might not want to talk about it as much. And they might benefit more from things like journaling, or doing art about it, or listening to music, making playlists that maybe help them emote or help them think about the person. But in all regards, kids need opportunities to talk about it. So even if you have an introverted kid that you're working with, letting them know constantly that you are there for them, that they can ask you questions, that they can tell you how they're feeling, that you want to care for them. Things like, for introverted and extroverted kids, things like art, drawing memories of the people and talking about them can be really nice, especially if a person was sick for a really long time, helping them remember before they were sick again. Or things like creating, like taking a shoebox and decorating it in honor of the person, and then that's a memory box for the future. Music can be really helpful, maybe writing songs about the person. Again, having playlists about different things that, like maybe that person's favorite music, or again, a playlist that you want to listen to when you're feeling sad about the person, a playlist you want to listen to if you actually kind of want to bring yourself out of sadness.
Yeah. I like the idea of different playlists. That's actually a really great idea.
Yeah. And kids who are musically inclined really benefit from that kind of stuff. My music therapy background, I would do a lot of like music improvisation with kids and have them kind of play out their feelings, or even like play a story out about the person. Writing, journaling, writing stories about the person. Things that are physical. So like kids that are feeling a lot of anger about the person might feel like you might start to see that show up in like maybe they're fighting kids at school.
Okay.
So getting them other physical release forms of release. So like I've had some kids and teens end up taking up boxing and it being super helpful.
Yeah.
Kids who are dancers, like kind of dancing it out, and I feel like physical movement is like kind of a sideways way to get emotions out, and we want to help them have awareness of that is happening and how it's happening and why, and it's such a healthy way to get stuff out. And even things like sports can be really helpful for people. Different types of memorializing, so like the memory box is an example. Creating like a picture, so having like a picture of the person and decorating a picture frame around it. Helping them figure out ways that they might want to memorialize on special days, like maybe the anniversary of the death or the person's birthday or the kid's birthday.
Oh, yeah.
They might want to bring the person into their birthday and like in their own way, or they might not.
Right.
All of that's okay.
Right.
I can't say enough, like normalizing, never minimizing. Helping kids understand that grief is going to kind of come and go probably for a long time.
Yeah.
I did work with a lot of kids who had this narrative in their head that they should get over it. Sometimes after 2 months, and kind of helping them release that narrative, because all that's going to do is make them feel bad about themselves for continuing to grieve. And then peer support is really important. And in Philadelphia, we have a few different resources for peer groups for kids who have lost people. Unfortunately, we have such a high rate of gun violence here that we have groups for kids who have lost people through gun violence. There are like overnight summer camps for grieving youth, most of which are free.
Oh, wow.
So encouraging those opportunities and connecting kids to that kind of thing. Knowing one of the hardest things about being a kid that's grieving is that they often don't know a lot of other kids who have been through something like this. So connecting them to other kids who have can be incredibly helpful.
Oh, I would imagine so. Just how lonely it could feel to think that you're the only one to be able to connect with other kids who maybe experience very similar feelings about who they lost and stuff.
Exactly.
I agree.
Yeah.
Shifting gears just a little bit, let's talk about how grief might manifest in different cultural communities.
Yeah, so I think about this a lot in terms of cultural humility. I'm a white person. I live in Philadelphia, which is, I guess they don't say it's a majority Black city because it's not over 50%, but there are more Black people than white people or Asian people or Latinx people in the city. And therefore, that meant when I was working with kids in Philadelphia, I was working with about 95% Black families. So it was really important that I put my own stuff in check, that I was really aware of my own stuff. And that includes like how I grieve and how do I think it's normal to grieve. So I can speak for my own. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm in the Midwest. Midwestern white people, I don't want to make too big of a sweeping stereotype, but my family, like we kind of like cover it and we like kind of keep it quiet and we keep it internal. And so, I don't really accept that anymore, but it might be harder for me. It is still sometimes harder for me to see people who are grieving really loudly in my mind. right? So like,
Okay.
if I'm seeing a lot of, especially when I was in hospice and working like literally at people's deathbeds, I would see a lot of like white nurses, for example, feeling uncomfortable with big emotions coming out, which is sometimes maybe more common with people who are not white, because that idea of like keeping things to yourself and keeping things inside is part of whiteness and part of
Yeah.
like white culture, right? One of those pretty unhealthy, in my opinion, parts of white culture. So I'd like to look at it from that lens rather than like say that like certain cultures of people grieve in certain ways, because like nobody's a monolith. So the most important thing is that you're aware of your own stuff so you can refrain from judgment. And you'll know if something is like not okay. It's going to be pretty obvious if that's true. So I think a lot about like completely trying to avoid any assumptions, right? If you think you know what's going to happen when you walk into a situation, especially if you're walking into a family whose culture is not yours, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't, and you got to put that stuff away before you walk in the door. And I also like to think about how culture will impact grief, but it's not going to define grief, right?
Like that.
So, so the ways in which it might impact grief is like different rituals that people will have because of their religions, for example. Different ways of memorializing people, different beliefs about what happens when you die. Like I said before, like different ways of emoting, which is across all human beings. And then a couple of terms that I wasn't taught in school. I kind of learned them later, but there are different types of grief that can show up more commonly in marginalized communities.
Okay.
One of those is called disenfranchised grief, which is defined as like grief that society is kind of denying you. So an example of that, in my experience from working with kids, like I said, in Philadelphia, we have such a horribly high rate of gun violence, and unfortunately impacts Black communities quite a bit. And I worked with a teenager who lost her friend to gun violence, and she was grieving him really hard, and she was keeping it to herself because at school, this teenager who was killed was being seen as someone who chose this life for himself and was of the streets, and he got what was coming for him.
Okay.
And so, and those are the words that she said were being said to her by other people. So she was being denied the right to really grieve him. And it was really important that I provide a really open, contained space for her to feel like she could do that safely. And then another one is ambiguous loss, and that's grieving someone who actually is not dead, but maybe they've left your life. And that's something that I feel like can be very common in the LGBTQ community. For example, like you're a parent who doesn't accept you because you're somewhere in the LGBTQ spectrum, and while you're angry at them, and maybe you have made the final choice to estrange from them, you also are going to experience grief for the loss of them and for the fact that they cannot understand you. Which maybe we might not go to grief therapy for that, but we could. Yeah. Or even a breakup.
Yeah.
Right? Like a really bad breakup. The person isn't dead, but you might never see them for ever again or for a very long time.
Of even the relationship, right?
Exactly.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Any other takeaways you'd like to share when it comes to helping kids deal with grief?
I guess I just wanted to share, like, I got to do grief work with kids before COVID, then during like the major part of COVID, and then like kind of like as we've been changing our attitude towards things. And it was interesting to see how our culture shifted a little bit during that time because we can't avoid talking about death when we had 1 million people dying of COVID in our country. And we certainly had there was much more of a need for bereavement during that time in Philly. And I was hopeful that there might be a little bit more of a culture shift towards us talking more about death in a public mainstream way, and talking about grief in a more public mainstream way. And I think that's happened. Not, we've kind of like, we like to now pretend everything's normal, and maybe that's a metaphor for like how we like to avoid death in US society. But it's just been interesting to see, and the need for grief and loss counseling right now across the board is very high.
I agree 100%, which again, I'm appreciative of this conversation we're having, Jae, and you really shared with us a lot of additional knowledge about helping kids navigate, just talking about death and dying, and then how to help them navigate the grieving process. Again, so important to have these conversations, and just having the conversations in general more out there within our cultures too. So I appreciate this conversation. So thank you again. Love to have you back on sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.